They were selling a human being for the price of a broken shovel. The sun beat down on Hastings Hollow like a hammer on an anvil, and the dust, it just hung in the air, thick and lazy. The men gathered in a half circle didn't seem to mind. They were vultures in wide-brimmed hats, waiting for something to die so they could pick it apart. On the creaking wooden stage, a girl stood wrapped in a silence so deep it felt louder than the auctioneer's voice. She couldn't have been more than 21. Her name, they whispered, was May, a China girl from the tracks. Nobody looked at her face. They looked at her hands, her wrists, the curve of her back. They looked at her like she was livestock. The auctioneer, a man with skin like cracked leather, spat a yellow stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Property of the late Mr. Lin," he barked, his voice grating. "Found with no papers, no protector, and a debt on the ledger." He grinned, showing teeth like rotted fence posts. "So she goes up for bidding? We'll start at $2. A laugh cut through the thick, shameful silence. A drunk man leaning against a post sloshed his drink. $2? Hell, there's less meat on her than a rabbit. The crowd rumbled with low, ugly laughter. The girl, May, didn't flinch. Her face was a mask of stone, her eyes fixed on something far beyond the dusty street and the leering faces. It was the look of someone who had learned long ago that the world was not meant to be kind. No one moved. No one raised a hand. $2 was an insult, but maybe, they thought, it was the right price. Then from the edge of the crowd a figure stepped forward. His boots made no sound in the dust. He was tall, lean, with a face carved by wind and time. The lines around his eyes weren't from smiling. They were from staring into the sun, waiting. His name was Jack Caldwell, a rancher, a widower. He didn't speak. He just raised two fingers. The auctioneer's eyes widened for a split second. He'd expected a fight, a spectacle, a slow, degrading bidding war. Not this. Not a clean, quiet claim from a man like Jack Caldwell. $2 from Mr. Caldwell, he shouted, his voice suddenly sharp. Do I hear 3? Do I hear 2.25? The silence that answered was heavier than before. It wasn't just shame now. It was confusion. Why would a man like Jack, a man who kept to himself, a man still mourning a wife and child lost 5 winters past, want a girl like this? No one dared to bid against him. "Sold!" The auctioneer barked, slamming his gavel down so hard a puff of dust rose from the podium. "To Mr. Caldwell, for $2. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Something had just happened here. Something they didn't understand. And in Hastings Hollow, anything people didn't understand, they feared. May stepped down from the stage. She didn't look at the hostile faces. Her eyes found Jack's boots, then traveled slowly up to his face. He didn't smile. He just held out a folded wool shawl. She took it, flinching slightly as his fingers brushed hers. A lifetime of caution in that one small movement. He turned and walked. She followed. And as they left the town behind, May had to wonder, had she just been saved, or had she just been sold to a different kind of monster? The walk back through town was a silent parade of whispers. Eyes followed them from behind parted curtains and shadowed doorways. Jack didn't look left or right. His focus was straight ahead, a man walking a line only he could see. May kept 3 paces behind him, the shawl he'd given her clutched in her hands. It smelled of cedar and cold, clean air. It was the first kindness she'd known in a very long time, and that scared her more than any cruelty. At the edge of town, an old steady horse waited. Jack mounted first, then held down a hand. She hesitated. Placing her hand in his felt like a surrender. But what choice did she have? He lifted her up behind him, his touch surprisingly gentle, like he was handling something already broken and didn't want to make it worse. But the way he did it, it wasn't the gentleness of a savior. It was the careful, practiced motion of a man who knew how to handle fragile things. The question was, why? They didn't take the main trail back to his ranch. Instead, Jack guided the horse onto a narrow, overgrown path that cut through the hills. It was the long way around, a path no one used unless they had a reason to, unless they didn't want to be seen. Every rustle in the grass, every shadow that stretched across the path, made the hairs on May's neck stand up. Was he protecting her, Or was he hiding his new property? The silence between them was a living thing, stretching and tightening with every mile. She watched the back of his neck, the set of his shoulders. She was looking for a weakness, an opening, a sign of what kind of man he truly was. She had survived this long by reading people, by knowing when to be still and when to run. And everything about Jack Caldwell screamed that he was a man with secrets buried deeper than the wells in this drought-stricken land. The sun began to set, painting the sky in bruised colors of purple and orange. Just as the first stars appeared, his ranch came into view. It was a simple two-story house nestled between two ancient cottonwood trees. It looked normal, safe even. But as they got closer, she saw it. On the windows of the small room at the back of the house on the ground floor. Faint in the twilight, but unmistakable. There were iron bars on the window. He helped her down from the horse, his hands firm on her waist. He didn't gesture towards the house or say a word. He just walked to the front door, unlocked it, and pushed it open. He lit a lamp, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows across a room that smelled of pine and old tobacco. It was clean, sparse, a man's home, a lonely man's home. He led her to the back of the house, to the small room she had seen from the outside, the room with the bars on the window. He placed the lamp on a small wooden chest at the foot of the narrow bed. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to say, "This is yours." And then he walked out. She heard the soft click of the door closing. She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. And then she heard the other sound, the sound she had been dreading, the unmistakable metallic scrape and thud of a key turning in the lock. From the outside, he had locked her in. The shawl slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. She wasn't his guest. She wasn't his ward. She was his prisoner. And as she stood there in the flickering lamplight, staring at the barred window, she knew the real auction had only just begun. She didn't sleep. How could she? She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, perfectly still, listening to the sounds of the house. The creak of floorboards, the sigh of the wind, the silence from the man in the other room. He was a jailer, but what kind? There was no anger in his movements, no malice in the quiet way he'd locked the door. It was something else, something cold and methodical. She spent the night testing her cage. The bars on the window were old, set deep into the wood. They didn't budge. The door was solid oak. There was no escape. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the bars, she heard the key in the lock again. The door swung open. Jack stood there, holding a tray with a bowl of rice and a cup of tea. He set it on the chest, his eyes not quite meeting hers. He didn't say a word. He just turned and left, leaving the door wide open. This was a different kind of prison. This was a test. May ate the rice slowly, her mind racing. The food wasn't poisoned. The door was open. What did he want from her? After she finished, she stepped out of the room. The house was silent. She walked through the main room, past the cold hearth, and out the front door. The morning air was crisp and cool. She saw him. He was out by the barn, his back to her. But he wasn't mending a fence or feeding the animals. He was standing perfectly still, staring down at the ground. She moved closer, silent as a shadow. And then she saw what he was looking at. Tucked away behind the barn, almost hidden by overgrown grass, were two small, weathered grave markers. One was larger for his wife. The other was heartbreakingly small, child-sized. He hadn't just lost a wife. He had lost a child, too. A wave of understanding, cold and sharp, washed over her. The bars on the window, the lock on the door. They weren't for her. They were for someone else. For a child he was trying to protect. A child he had failed to keep safe. He was a man drowning in grief, and he was replaying his worst nightmare with her as a stand-in for his lost daughter. The realization didn't make her feel safe. It made her feel terrified. She was a ghost in this man's house, a placeholder for a memory. She retreated back to the porch, her heart a cold knot in her chest. A little while later, he came back from the barn, his face as unreadable as ever. He walked past her and went into the house. Days began to fall into a strange, silent rhythm. Every morning, he would leave her food and unlock the door. Every night, he would lock it again. He never spoke to her. He never touched her. He just moved around her, a phantom in his own home. She started to explore her cage. One afternoon, while he was out riding the fence line, she searched the small room he'd given her. Tucked away in the back of the wooden chest under a stack of old blankets, she found a box. It wasn't locked. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, beautiful silk dress. It was an impossible thing to find in a place like this, exquisitely embroidered with cherry blossoms. Beneath it, a man's ring, a simple gold band. This wasn't his wife's. The style was wrong, foreign. This belonged to someone else, someone who had been in this room before her. A few days later, she found something else. In the main room, on the mantelpiece above the hearth, was a collection of dusty objects. A tarnished silver cup, a pair of worn-out work gloves, and a small, leather-bound frame, face down. Curiosity, a dangerous, reckless thing, got the better of her. Her hand shook as she reached out and turned it over. It was a photograph, faded and cracked, of Jack and a woman, his wife. She was smiling, her head resting on his shoulder, and as May stared at the image, a cold dread snaked its way up her spine. The woman in the photograph, the smiling, long-dead wife. She looked unnervingly like May. The same dark hair, the same shape of the eyes, the same delicate line of the jaw. It wasn't a perfect resemblance, but it was close enough to be terrifying. He hadn't bought her by chance. He hadn't bought her to settle a debt. He had searched for her. He had found her. He was trying to replace the dead, and she was trapped in a house with a man who looked at her and saw a ghost. The knowledge was a poison. Every time he looked at her, every time he left food by her door, she could feel the weight of his dead wife's ghost settling over her. She had to do something, anything to break the spell, to prove that she was a living, breathing person, not a replacement. She decided to claim a piece of this land for herself. Behind the house, there was a small, fallow patch of earth, an unspoken offering. She found a rusty hoe in the barn and began to turn the soil. Her hands, soft from a life of servitude, blistered and bled, but she didn't stop. She was clawing her way back to life, one handful of dirt at a time. She planted seeds she'd managed to hide in the hem of her dress, tomatoes, herbs, and the tiny white flowers her mother used to boil for fever. It was an act of defiance. One morning, Harlan, Jack's old ranch hand, rode up with supplies. He was a kind-faced man, with eyes that had seen too much. He saw her in the garden, her sleeves rolled up, dirt smudged on her cheek. He tipped his hat but didn't just offer a tired smile. He dismounted and walked over to the fence, his expression grim. "He's a good man, miss," Harlan said, his voice low. "But grief makes good men do strange things." The fire, it took more than his wife and daughter. It took a part of him, too. "You be careful." A fire. Harlan's words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Later that day, Jack saw the garden. He saw the neat rows, the budding life, and his face, usually a mask of calm, twisted into something dark and unrecognizable. He strode into the garden, his boots crushing the soft earth, and his eyes fixed on the small white flowers. With a choked cry, he knelt and began ripping them from the ground, tearing them out by the roots as if they were venomous snakes. He didn't stop until every last one was gone, leaving only torn soil and his own heavy breathing in the sudden, ringing silence. He stood up, his hands covered in dirt, and looked at her. For the first time, she saw something other than grief in his eyes. She saw pure, raw fury. He had brought her here to be a ghost, a quiet, pliable memory. He had not brought her here to grow things. He had not brought her here to be alive. And by planting those flowers, she had broken the rules of his haunted house. The test was over, and she had failed. The incident with the flowers changed everything. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was thick with tension. He still locked her in at night, but now it felt less like a grief-stricken ritual and more like a punishment. He was angry with her for reminding him that she was real. May knew she was running out of time. She had to understand the man who held her captive, or she would end up just like the woman in the photograph, a memory in a dusty frame. One night, a sliver of moonlight guided her. She saw a light burning in the small room Jack used as an office. He often sat in there late at night, but she'd never dared to look. Tonight, she did. She crept to the door, which was slightly ajar, and peered through the crack. He was hunched over the desk, a single lamp illuminating a large leather-bound ledger. He wasn't looking at land deeds or ranch accounts. His finger was tracing a line of neat, cruel script. Her blood ran cold. She recognized the ledger. It was from the auction. It was Mr. Lynn's. She held her breath, her eye pressed to the crack in the door. He turned a page. And there it was. A long list of debts owed by the late Mr. Lynn. And at the bottom of the page, a final entry underlined twice. A massive sum, enough to buy a dozen ranches, owed to one man, Jack Caldwell. A lightning bolt of horrifying clarity struck her. This was never about grief. This was never about replacing his dead wife. This was about money, about power. Jack hadn't saved her by chance. He wasn't some grieving Samaritan. He was Lynn's biggest creditor. He had been there at the auction to collect. She wasn't a replacement for his dead wife. She was collateral. She was the final payment on a dead man's debt. The $2 he paid was a mockery, a legal farce to make it all official. He owned her, same as Lynn had. The bars, the locked door. It was all to protect his investment. She stumbled back from the door, a silent scream trapped in her throat. She had been a fool. The kindness, the shawl, the gentle touch. It was all a lie. The careful performance of a predator lulling its prey. She was trapped here, not with a broken man, but with a cold, calculating businessman who had bought her like a piece of furniture. She had to escape. But how? The next night the sky broke open. A storm rolled in, fierce and sudden, lashing the plains with wind and rain. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the house. It was a reflection of the war raging inside her. She was in her room, the door locked as usual, when a bolt of lightning struck one of the old cottonwood trees by the house. There was a sound like the sky splitting in two, and the whole house shuddered. A moment later, she smelled smoke. The tree was on fire, flames licking dangerously close to the roof of the barn. She heard Jack shout outside, then the frantic sound of him trying to battle the blaze in the pouring rain. She was locked in. If the fire spread to the house, she would be trapped. She screamed his name, banging on the solid oak door with her fists, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. This was how she would die, trapped in a cage by a man who saw her as nothing more than an entry in a ledger. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room, searching for a weapon, a tool, anything. Her eyes fell on the heavy wooden chest at the foot of her bed. With a surge of adrenaline, she heaved it across the floor and began to ram it against the door. Once, twice. The old wood groaned. On the third impact, there was a crack. On the fourth, the lock splintered and the door flew open. She burst out of the room, wild and desperate, into the main living area. And she stopped dead. Jack was standing there, soaked to the bone, his face black with soot. He was holding the key to her room in his hand. He had been on his way to unlock the door. Their eyes met across the room, the storm raging outside, a different kind of storm building between them. "You think I'd let you burn?" he rasped, his voice raw. But she wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on the ledger, which he must have brought out from the office. It was sitting on the kitchen table. Without a word, she walked past him, picked up the heavy book, and slammed it down on the table in front of him, the sound echoing the thunder outside. She pointed to his name, to the debt. She had no words to fight with, so she would fight with his own ugly truth. He looked from the ledger to her face, and something in his expression finally broke. The mask of the cold businessman, the grieving husband, it all fell away, leaving behind a man who looked utterly defeated. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice barely a whisper over the roar of the storm. He sank into a chair, running a hand through his wet hair. "Lynn, he wasn't just in debt. He was a monster." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were filled with a pain so profound it stole her breath. "He trafficked girls. He brought them over, promised them lives, and sold them into misery. I wasn't his partner. I was trying to destroy him." He explained it all in a torrent of words held back for years. He had systematically bought up Lynn's debt, trying to ruin him, to free the women he'd enslaved. But Lynn died before Jack could finish the job. I was at the auction to find you, he admitted, to get you away from his associates before they could claim you. The $2, it was the only way to make it legal, to give me a claim that would hold up. And the house, the locked door? This house, my wife Sarah, and my daughter Lily, they didn't die in an accident. His voice cracked. Lynn's men set the fire because I was getting too close. The bars on the window, the lock. I put them there to keep Lily safe. She was so small, always trying to wander. The night of the fire, the lock was jammed. I couldn't get to her. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He wasn't a jailer replaying a fantasy. He was a man trapped in his own guilt, reliving the moment he failed to save his family, trying desperately to do it right this time. And the white flowers she had planted, the ones he had ripped from the ground in a rage, they were Lynn's favorite, he whispered, his voice thick with disgust. He put them in the hair of every girl he sold, seeing them in my garden, in the place I built for Sarah. I couldn't bear it. The storm outside began to subside, its fury spent. The fire in the cottonwood tree was just a smoldering ember. Inside the house, the silence returned, but it was a different silence. It was the quiet after a battle, the stillness of two broken people who had finally shown each other their scars. He hadn't bought her. He had rescued her, and in trying to save her, he was desperately trying to save himself. The confession changed the air between them. They were no longer captor and captive, master and property. They were two survivors, huddled together in the wreckage of their past. The door to her room was never locked again. The house, once a prison, started to feel like a sanctuary. But they both knew the storm had not truly passed. Lynn's associates were still out there. They were not the kind of men to let a valuable asset simply disappear. A week later, a boy from town rode up the trail, his horse lathered in sweat. He carried a note. It was news about her supposed father, the man who had brought her to this country. He was dead. An opium overdose, the note said. No funeral, no debts cleared. Just another ghost left behind. Jack took the note and read it, his jaw tight. He looked at May. He wasn't your father, May, he said softly. He was one of Lynn's recruiters, the man who sold you to him in the first place. The news should have been devastating. Another loss, another betrayal. But instead, it was a release. The last chain connecting her to that life had just been broken. As Jack burned the note in the stove, they saw the dust cloud on the horizon. 3 riders moving with a purpose that made the air feel cold. They were not neighbors. Jack grabbed his rifle from its place above the mantel. Stay inside, he ordered. But May shook her head. She would not hide, not anymore. She stood on the porch just behind him as the men rode up to the gate. The man in the middle was tall, with slicked back hair and a smile that was all teeth. May recognized him. He was one of the men who had been with Lynn. Caldwell, the man said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. Name's Wilson. We're here on behalf of Consolidated Mining and Claims. Seems there's been a complication with the estate of Mr. Lynn. Jack's grip on his rifle tightened. There's no complication. She belongs to no one. Wilson chuckled, a low, nasty sound. That's not what the paper says, friend. Her contract was pledged as collateral, bought out by a partner in Silverpine. We're here to collect. Silverpine. The name was a whisper of death in the camps and the back alleys, a place where girls went and never came back. She's under my roof, Jack said, his voice a low growl. That doesn't make her free, Wilson sneered. It does now, Jack replied. Wilson's smile faded. He looked from Jack's determined face to May, standing defiant on the porch. He saw something there he hadn't expected. This wasn't going to be easy. This isn't over, Caldwell, he spat, wheeling his horse around. We'll be back, and we'll have the law with us next time. They rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. Jack knew Wilson was right. His $2 purchase was a flimsy claim against a signed contract, no matter how depraved. They needed more than a rifle. They needed a fortress. That night, Jack didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with old land deeds and county maps spread out before him. At dawn, he rode for town. He returned at dusk, looking exhausted but determined. He handed May a folded piece of paper. It was a legal document, stamped with the official seal of the county clerk. She couldn't read all the English words, but she understood the two names at the top, Jack Caldwell and May, and the word below them, ownership transfer. He had put the ranch in her name. She stared at him, the paper trembling in her hand. "Why?" she whispered, finding her voice. His eyes, pale as river ice, met hers, and for the first time she saw no ghost in them. He saw her. "Because you deserve to stand on your own land," he said, his voice raw with an emotion he couldn't name. "You deserve roots. This is your home now. Let them try to take you from it." Her lips parted, but no words came out. She pressed the paper to her chest. It was the first thing in her entire life that had ever truly belonged to her. They were no longer just allies. They had drawn a line in the dirt together. They had built a wall against the world, and they would stand behind it, side by side, no matter what came next. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of silence, not of fear or uncertainty, but of shared purpose. They worked to fortify the ranch, mending fences, securing the barn, preparing for a siege. It was during this time that they truly began to learn each other. She taught him the names of the herbs in her garden. He taught her how to sight along the barrel of a rifle. They didn't speak of the past. They spoke of the future, a future they were building with their own hands. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, he told her about Lily, how she had loved the smell of rain and the color of the wildflowers in the spring. May, in turn, told him about her brother, the one with ink-stained hands who used to draw birds for her on scraps of paper. They were sharing their ghosts, letting them walk in the light. Harlan became a frequent visitor, bringing news from town. "They're stirring things up," he warned. "Wilson's been flashing papers, talking to the sheriff. He's coming back, Jack, and he's bringing the law." Jack just nodded. "Let him." The day came sooner than they expected. Wilson returned, and he wasn't alone. He had the two deputies from Hastings Hollow with him, and a man in a gray suit who looked like he'd never seen a dirt road in his life, the lawyer. They rode up to the gate, confident and smug. "This is your last chance, Caldwell," the lawyer called out. "Interfering with a legal transaction is a serious offense." Jack and May met them on the porch. This time they stood shoulder to shoulder. "She's not a transaction," Jack said, his voice steady and clear. The lawyer scoffed and unrolled a long, important-looking document. It was the contract, pledging May as collateral to Lynn's partners. "This is a legally binding instrument," he declared. But before he could continue, Jack held up his own paper. "The deed. This land, this house, everything on it belongs to Miss May," Jack announced, his voice ringing across the yard. "You are trespassing on her property. I suggest you leave." The lawyer's face went slack with shock. He stared at the deed, then at May. This changed everything. Wilson's face contorted with rage. "This is a trick," he snarled. "It won't hold up." "It'll hold up long enough," a new voice drawled. They all turned. Sheriff Nolan, gray and slow-moving, was riding up the trail. He wasn't alone. Behind him were Harlan and a half-dozen other ranchers and townsfolk, all holding rifles. "Plain as church bell," the sheriff said, tipping his hat to May. "A person can give their land to whomever they please. Ain't no law against it. Now these folks," he gestured to the armed men behind him, "are here to make sure Miss May's property rights are respected. So I'd advise you all to move along." Wilson stared at the line of determined faces, at the rifles held loosely but ready. He had brought the law, but he had found the community. He was defeated. With a final venomous glare, he and his men turned and rode away. That night the ranch was quiet. The stars seemed brighter, closer. May stood in her garden, her hands buried in the cool earth. She had won. She was free. Jack came and stood beside her. "I wasn't sure they'd leave," he admitted, his voice full of relief. She looked up at him, the moonlight soft on her face. "They always leave when something isn't theirs for the taking," she said. He turned to face her, his silhouette dark against the star-dusted sky. "But you stayed." Her eyes met his, and in their depths he saw not a victim, Not a ghost, but a woman as strong as the land she now stood on. "You gave me roots," she whispered. A silence fell, thick with everything they had been through, everything they had not yet said. Slowly she stepped forward. She raised a hand and brushed his cheek with her fingertips, a touch as soft as a moth's wing. Then she rested her forehead against his. It wasn't a kiss. It was something more. A recognition. A mooring. In that quiet moment, they both understood that love wasn't a sudden storm. It was the slow, steady growth of a seed planted in hard soil. It was the choice to stand together when the world tried to tear you apart. The air was thick with the scent of turned earth in the promise of rain. "I want to build something," May whispered against his chest. Jack's lips curved into a faint smile, the first real smile she had ever seen on his face. "So do I." And together, under the watchful eyes of the stars, they planted the first rose bush by the porch. Not because it was practical, but because after so much ugliness, they needed to cultivate something beautiful. The decision to marry was as quiet and natural as the changing of the seasons. There was no grand proposal, no ring, just a conversation on the porch one evening as they watched the new roses bloom. "I don't know how to say it right," Jack had murmured, turning a carved piece of wood over and over in his hands. "But I want to stand beside you, all the way." May had simply taken the piece of wood from him. It was a small, intricately carved bird, and placed her hand in his. "I choose this," she'd said. It was enough. Harlan married them under the big cottonwood tree, the one that had been struck by lightning and survived. He read from a worn book, not of scripture, but of poetry. Mrs. Dolly, the preacher's widow who had once clicked her tongue at the scandal, stood as their witness. She had brought them a freshly baked pie, her own quiet apology. May wore a simple cream-colored dress she had sewn herself. Around her waist was a red silk sash, the only thing she had left from her mother. Jack wore a dark coat and a look of such profound peace it made him seem like a different man. They didn't exchange vows of love. They exchanged promises of partnership, of steadfastness. When Harlan pronounced them joined, they didn't kiss. They simply held hands and looked at the horizon, at the future they would face together. It was a perfect quiet moment. And of course, that's when the riders appeared. There were more of them this time. At least 10, maybe more, cresting the hill like a dark wave. At the front was Wilson, his face a mask of triumphant fury, and beside him, a man whose presence made the air turn to ice. He was older, dressed in fine city clothes, but his eyes were those of a predator. This was the partner from Silverpine, the man who truly owned her contract. This wasn't about the law anymore. They hadn't come with papers. They had come with guns. "Run, May," Jack said, pushing her toward the house. "Get the deed. Hide it." But May stood her ground. She looked at the approaching riders, at the man who thought he owned her, and a lifetime of fear and silence burned away into cold, hard resolve. "No," she said, her voice steady. "No more hiding." The riders fanned out, surrounding the small group by the cottonwood tree. "The wedding was a nice touch, Caldwell," Wilson sneered, "but the party's over. The lady has a prior commitment." The man from Silverpine dismounted, walking toward them with a slow, deliberate gait. "You have caused me a great deal of trouble," he said, his voice calm, which made it all the more terrifying. "But I am a patient man. I've come to collect my property." He reached out a hand to grab May's arm, and that's when it happened. In a blur of motion too fast to follow, May moved. She sidestepped his grasp, her hand darting to the red silk sash at her waist. There was a faint zipping sound, and something flashed in the sunlight. The man from Silverpine froze, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. A thin red line appeared across the back of his outstretched hand. He hadn't been reaching for a helpless girl. He had been reaching for a warrior. The red silk sash wasn't just a memento from her mother. It was a weapon. Woven into its length, nearly invisible, was a thin, razor-sharp wire. A garrote, a tool for fighting in close quarters. A secret she had carried with her all this time. Wilson and his men stared, momentarily stunned. Jack reacted first. He brought his rifle up, firing not at a man, but into the dirt at their feet. "Get off this land!" he roared. Harlan and the other ranchers raised their own weapons. The standoff was a tense, breathless moment. The man from Silver Pine clutched his bleeding hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and shock. He had expected a victim. He had found an equal. He looked at May, at the calm, deadly certainty in her eyes. And for the first time in his life, he felt a sliver of fear. He saw that this wasn't land he could conquer. This was a home, and the people standing on it would die before they let him take it. Without a word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. His men, confused and leaderless, hesitated for a moment and then followed him, a retreat as quiet and sudden as their arrival. They were gone, for good this time. A long, shuddering breath passed through the small group. It was over. Jack turned to May, his eyes full of questions. He looked at the red sash she was carefully, methodically retying around her waist. "You were never helpless," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of awe. She met his gaze, and for the first time, she let him see all the way in. The girl who had been sold, the woman who had survived, the fighter who had been waiting for her moment. "I was never afraid of them," she said softly. "I was only afraid of disappearing, of being forgotten." He reached out and gently touched her cheek. "I see you, May," he whispered. "I've always seen you." She leaned into his touch, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I know," she said. They stood there, hand in hand, under the shade of the tree that had refused to burn. The story of the girl who was bought for $2 was over. But the story of the woman who owned the Caldwell Ranch, the woman who had fought for her own freedom and found a partner who would fight alongside her, that story was just beginning. They didn't just find a quiet life, they built a legacy. The ranch became a sanctuary, a place where people who had been broken by the world could come and find roots. They stood against mining companies that tried to steal land. They offered shelter to travelers lost on the plains, and their home became a symbol of quiet, unyielding strength. The love between them wasn't loud or passionate. It was as deep and steady as the bedrock beneath the prairie. It was in the way he'd bring her the first wildflower of spring, and the way she'd leave a cup of tea for him by the fire on a cold night. It was a love forged not in a fairy tale, but in the harsh, unforgiving crucible of the real world. They proved that home isn't a place you find. It's a place you build, a place you defend, a place you choose day after day. And their story, whispered from town to town, became a legend. A story of how two broken souls, a quiet man and a silent warrior, stood together and reminded everyone that even in the dust and the heat, something beautiful, something strong, something worth fighting for, can always, always grow. If this story of resilience and unexpected strength moved you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Every story has a hero, but sometimes they're not the one you expect. Let me know in the comments below who you think the real hero of this story was, Jack or May. Thanks for stopping by the strange and forgotten corners of history with me. Until next time, stay safe and always be ready to fight for your own patch of ground.